Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 24 today after David has stealthily cut off the corner of the cloak of the king, the Lord's anointed. And as we look at this passage today, we're mostly going to be listening to David speaking first to his men about what he has just done, and then to Saul about what he has just done. And as we looked at in the last video and the introductory video to this section, one of the key themes that we need to be focusing on behind all the details is how does one or a community discern that God, Yahweh in this case, is with them in what they're doing. So you can see on the left side of the screen, on the top of the screen, the verse 4 that we looked at last time, the men of David discern based on the fact that Saul happens to walk into the same cave they're in En Gedi. Here is the day of which Yahweh said to you, I will give your enemy in your hand, and you shall do to him as seems good to you, or literally what looks good in your eyes. So they discern that the coincidence is a divine plan. But is it? And even then, what does that mean? So that's going to be one of many examples we're going to see. Because even if we can understand that Yahweh has put Saul in the cave with David, what does Yahweh want David to do? Is it to kill him? Is it to symbolically kill him as he does, or symbolically castrate him as he did, which he immediately, as we'll see today, regrets. So that's the theme we're going to have to look at as we go. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, all the key words that are in this chapter, and many are hidden by translation. So as we looked at last time, the Hebrew henna, or often vahena, and behold, is almost always hidden by the New Revised Standard, which is what I use over here. And you see how many times it's there to highlight that David is drawing attention, or the men of David are drawing attention to what's going on. There's another interesting theme that's hidden behind translation, so I've highlighted here, and that's the use of the Hebrew word achari for after. And after in English and in Hebrew has the same double meaning, both in the sense of sequence of time, but also in the sense of going after somebody, of chasing after them. So we see here, afterward David is stricken is plainly about time, a sequence. But here, when Saul looked after him, that's somebody you're looking to chase. And again, down here, after whom has the king of Israel come out? So we see that's a number of times in here. But in our section today, we can also see that the Lord's anointed, or Yahweh's anointed, is key, and the rising up, the word for rising up so many times in this section. Literally to stand up, but also to rise up and claim one's authority, whether that's God-given authority or not. And as we've been looking at, and we'll look at specifically in today's passage, so I'll look at it now, the comparison between chapter 24 and chapter 26. And it's one of the elements here that leads some scholars, like Cynthia Edenberg, to suggest that chapter 26 here on the right side of the screen is the original, and chapter 24 is a copy that's been edited in some way, based on the element that she discerns here, that what David says here, in verse 6 in the English, the verses in the Hebrew are all one off, but we'll refer to the English verses. Lord forbid that I should do what he's already done. Whereas in chapter 26, when he says, Yahweh forbid that I should raise my hand, it's in response to Abishai suggesting that God has given your enemy in your hand. Let me pin him to the ground. And David says no. So people like Edenberg and others suggest that this story seems out of order or out of place because of the way this sequence unfolds. And that's one way to read it, but I'd like to suggest it's not the only way to read it. So I'm going to suggest we read it however it got here, whether it's a version of chapter 26 rewritten or not. Somebody chose to write it this way, and if it seems out of order, that's to draw our attention to something. So we're going to read it this way, even with the narrative interruptions that some people see. So as we looked last time, as I was noting, the men of David say, do what seems good to you in your eyes. And we just looked briefly at what he chose to do is go stealthily or secretly or privately cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. But why that? Perhaps they were imagining just kill him and get rid of him. Or what else could he do? He could have talked to him and not done something symbolically. He could have just highlighted verbally, look, you were sitting there squatting right in front of us, relieving yourself, completely vulnerable, and I have 400 men in here, and we could have dispatched you easily, but we didn't. But instead what he does is a symbolic castration, as we looked at last time, and becomes a figure in this section, as we see, and also part of a whole series of little chiasms we'll see. It's an interesting way this section is constructed that we'll look at in just a moment. So immediately after he does that, the narrator says, afterward David was stricken to the heart, and it's almost literally, that was literally heart struck. As Edelman notes below, she takes this as a sincere concern for doing the right thing, rather than a strategic stand to protect the future king, David himself, which is a theme we have to look at and readers have to decide. Is David sincerely concerned with protecting Yahweh's anointed, or is it a strategic thing he says in order to protect his future self as Yahweh is anointed? And we can't answer that all now, but as we read the entire entire books of Samuel, we'll see how many times David, like so many politicians, says things publicly, whether that publicly is just amongst his men or before the people of Jerusalem later when he's enthroned, that serve the interests of himself in terms of the interest of the nation. So that the king's interest, personal interest, and the nation's interests are identified. And of course, Yahweh's interest and the nation's interests are identified, but that doesn't mean that the human king that Yahweh has put there is the same thing as Yahweh. We've already seen that with Saul. So he's stricken to the heart because he had done this, and now he speaks to his men. And before we look at his speech, I want to highlight the interesting way this is structured with a whole little series of ABA chiasms. And I didn't put the ABAs on there because you can see that, and some of them are even left out of translations. For example, in 2410a, the NORSV leaves out the second this day. But here they all are, these simple phrases, simple sections where a phrase is repeated and there's something in the middle there. We'll see those as we go, and I can even leave that up. But it's only in David's speech. After verse 15, we don't see that anymore. And I've not seen that other scholars have noted this series of chiasms, although they certainly do note the repetitions. So there they are, breaking David's speech, both to his men at first and then to Saul, and to these little repetitive segments. Perhaps it has the function of slowing things down, but it also has the function of emphasizing the things that are repeated each day so we can hear them more clearly. So I'll put up the key words as we go through, and we can remember that those are there, and I'll point them out as we go. So he says to his men, Yahweh forbid that I should do this thing. And the word for forbid here is actually this phrase, often translated, far be it from me, Halila li. And I want to show where that is used here in Samuel, because it reveals a number of interesting things. It's a strong phrase where people are basically saying, this can never happen, or I would never do this. And so I've underlined the things that they would, and each character would never do. So this is Samuel, or a man of God, not Samuel, to Eli at the beginning, suggesting that in Yahweh's voice, those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be treated with contempt. Far be it from me that the family of Eli should go in and out forever, given their corruption. That's what's at issue there. And then Samuel says way later in chapter 12, when he's talking to Saul, far be it from me I should sin against Yahweh by ceasing to pray from you. I didn't underline this one here, but the people have said to Saul, shall Jonathan die? And they say, no, Jonathan shall not die. And similarly here, Jonathan says to David, you shall not die at the hand of his father. A little later, Ahimelech says to Saul, is this today the first time I've inquired of God for him, which is to say for David? By no means. In other words, he's not ashamed at all of inquiring to Yahweh on behalf of David, and that'll lead him and the other 85 priests of Nob to be killed. And we have our current passage here and the parallel in chapter 26. And then it jumps all the way near the very end of 2 Samuel before we hear it again. And it's an interesting thing. We don't hear it to the end. From Joab, David's commander-in-chief, way at the end there. Far be it from me twice that I should swallow up or destroy. And we'll see that in context. And then finally, near the very end, we hear here that David suggests he will not drink the blood, which is to say water, but he sees it symbolically as that of men who are at the risk of their lives, and he would not drink it. So our passage here about Yahweh forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord highlights how both the writer and David here are making clear that he would never do that. This is something really strong that he would not do. So, and it's described here as a thing, but it's literally this word. In Hebrew, dabar, which literally means word, can mean this thing, like a verbal thing, that something you say in words and then you do, which is what happens here. So, I should not do this, God forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord. And notice, as we saw in the key words that connected all the sections, the use of my Lord here, 25 of the uses in 1 Samuel. Of 25, 20 are in these 3 chapters. So that's quite a bit. And my Lord is always going to be ambiguous here about whether it's Yahweh or whether it's the king. And it's made unnecessarily ambiguous here in the New Revised Standard, because usually all caps Lord means Yahweh in the background, while lowercase with initial cap Lord means Adonai or something else. But it's actually Yahweh in all 3 places. So I can't say why whoever made the typography of the New RSV here didn't put Lord in all caps there. But this one is Adon, and these 3 are all Yahweh. So it's not that much of a repetition here. But it's plainly a question, since Yahweh would not have been spoken out loud, and Adonai was the way people referred to it. The question of who is the Lord? Is it the king or is it God? And is that the same thing? And so that will continue to play out throughout the entire monarchy story. And it goes to one of the questions we've been looking at in this section in terms of the time and cultural context of composition. Is this to be understood as part of the rise of David that justifies why David replaces Saul as king? Or is it coming from way later near the end of the monarchy, asking the question of, was monarchy actually the will of God at all, given the violence and murder that's involved in it? But that question won't get answered till the very end. So, having said this, now he scolds his men severely, and we need to look closely at the language of this. And notice all they had said was, do what looks good in your own eyes. And yet he understood that as do something against the Lord's anointed. So the word for scolded here is restrained his men, or literally rejected the word, or as some more suggests, disagreed about the matter here. But the word severely is literally split, and the word can literally be for a split hoof, a cloven hoof, or to tear apart. So literally, it's like he ripped them to shreds here and would not permit them, and we need to look closely at that too, literally not give him to stand up against Saul. And the translation here reveals all those differences between here and there. And one reason I wanted to highlight that is, did not permit them to rise up against Saul. Then Saul rose up and left the cave. And then David rose up. So there's a lot of rising up in this section. Almost none of it can you see here in the translations. So they would not permit them to rise up against Saul. So Saul then got up, not knowing any of this has happened. Still at this point, and how that can be that David is speaking to his 400 men in this cave where Saul is relieving himself, squatting in front of them, and Saul misses the whole thing and has no idea how close he came to dying and went on his way, Derek here, on his way. And so afterward, following this theme in the chapter, David rose up and went out of the cave, and it's curiously doubled here in the Hebrew. It's not clear why. Usually verbs are doubled for emphasis, and so why the noun would be doubled is plain to the cave, and I don't know why. But he called after Saul. And notice what's happening here. If you're Saul, you're leaving this cave, going back to your 3,000 men, and suddenly you're hearing this voice from behind you that you certainly ought to recognize, and yet we'll see that he does not. And he called after Saul, my Lord the King. And so David refers to Saul as my Lord the King. He doesn't question that issue. And then when Saul looks behind him here, notice it's an unusual word for seeing. It's not the normal word for seeing. It's an unusual word. But look behind him or after him. Notice two afters in the verse here. David bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance. So David is doing exactly what one would expect one to do as a loyal servant to the king. And there's nothing on the surface of it that would suggest David is anything but subservient to the king and hoping to convince the king that David would not ever do anything against the Lord's anointed. But again, as readers, do we buy into that or not? And again, we don't have to answer that right now. So now David begins to speak to Saul. And as Barbara Green notes below, a variation of his what have I done question articulated by himself and Jonathan back in the Goliath story when his brother said, what brought you out here? And he says, what have I done? And then when he says it in chapter 20 to Jonathan in relation to why Jonathan's father Saul was chasing him down. So he says here, why do you listen to the words of those who say David seeks to do you harm or do you evil? But we haven't heard that. As with his men, this quote has not been heard by readers. So we don't know how that is supposed to come across from David to Saul to hear something he hasn't heard. And again, leaving out another behold that we see right here. This very day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand. And yet that's exactly what Saul's eyes did not see, as many people note. As Barbara Green notes below, David makes Saul a witness to exactly what he did not see, and in fact rereads what we did see, asking us to change our sense of it. That is, David urges Saul, listen instead to what you did not hear, how some urged me to kill you, though we must note that none of the men used such blunt language, nor did the narrator. So David is playing with Saul, even if we don't carefully notice that here. That's what's happening. Your eyes have seen how Yahweh gave you into my hand. And notice how he's taking up the theology, the theological inference of his men. Yet the coincidence is causation, not just coincidence, that the fact they ended up in the same cave as an expression of Yahweh's will, that he should do whatever David wanted to do, put him into his hand, which is say put power over him. And some, or literally a man, urged me to kill you, although we heard it was the men of Saul, not just the one. And literally said here. And as Halberstam and Holmes suggest here, to the extent that the double reversal of ends and means dominates the political life of those who aim to seize and hold power, morality itself becomes a matter of tactics. The question of urging to kill is a matter of tactics between David and Saul. Here, the killing comes out openly here, and it's here and again in verse 12 and in 19, but only one other time here in 1 Samuel that we hear about killing in such an explicit form. And as Green notes below, David has made a particular construction of the more general suggestion, do what seems good, leaving out in your own eyes. But he says, but I spared you. Literally, my eye looked upon you with compassion. Omitting my eye by idiom, as Samora notes here. So a lot of the eyes stuff, the literal seeing, is left out in the translation here. I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. And again, we can see how that plays out in all the little chiasms. So David is making as strong a case as he can here, but it's based on things that are basically not true, that Saul has not heard that said, and he's not seen what David says he's seen. So he's filling in his argument here with some counterfactual elements. And then he goes on to refer to Saul as my father, which is really quite a thing given the hostility between them earlier. And Saul will refer to David as my son as well. So see here, see, and here it's not Hannah, interestingly. It's a double C, as you can see in the text below. See, yes, my father, see. The corner of your cloak in my hand. And as Edelman notes below, cannot help but to call to mind for both the audience and Saul the earlier robe-rending incident in chapter 15, which is when Saul grabbed Samuel's corner of Samuel's cloak, and Samuel interpreted that as tearing away a piece of his kingdom. And so we can interpret that the same way here, although Saul will lose his whole kingdom, not just a piece of it. So see, my father, the corner of your cloak, for by the fact, or literally because I cut off the corner of your cloak, notice the little ABA chiasm, and did not kill you, you may know for certain, or you may know and see, there is no wrong or evil or treason, pesha here, which is one of the things that links it with the Nabal story in chapter 25, as we saw last time, in my hands. No evil or treason in my hands. And as Biddle notes below, David's denial of a trespass against Saul echoes against Abigail's plea for forgiveness of her trespass against David. That's the parallel with chapter 25. He says, I have not sinned against you. Curiously, one of the rare uses of sin in this whole section, just here and the parallel in chapter 26, but only a few times earlier as describing people's behavior. And notice that's implying Yahweh again, that sinning is by definition doing something against God, not just something against a person, but doing something against God. I have not sinned against you, though you are hunting me to take my life. And the phrase here, va'ata tzodeh, the va'ata is just and now, which is also repeated many times here. But the phrase is only here in Samuel, one time in Exodus 21, as lying in wait. And so that's a suggestion here that Saul was lying in wait with, of course, great irony. While he's squatting, relieving himself, he's hardly in a position of lying in wait to take on David. The partridge, or the flea that we'll see later, he refers to himself as. So our section today ends in verse 12 with David's rhetoric turning this into a covenant lawsuit. And a covenant lawsuit is something we see in the prophets, especially in Micah 6 is a classic example, as you can see here. But let's look at the language of this, and I'll bring up the little chiasm so we can see how it actually plays out interestingly in the Hebrew, because the word order is different in the Hebrew than it is in the English. So in the English we have, may Yahweh judge between me and you, may Yahweh avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. And so what you really can't see there is twice the word reeb for controversy or covenant lawsuit. The language for judge suggests that, but really it's more specifically, may he judge the controversy between me and you, and the controversy he judge with his hand. So it's more like an A-B chiasm with the between me and you there, but it makes an A-B-A, as we've seen. So he's calling upon Yahweh to be the decider here, assuming, as he does and as he's presented to Saul, that the fact that they were in this cave together is Yahweh's will, and the fact that David has chosen not to kill the Lord's anointed means David is innocent, and Saul should stop pursuing him like he's a flea or a dead dog, as we'll see next time. And we'll pick up the end of David's speech in verse 13 there, and then see how Saul responds to this little piece of rhetoric from the soon-to-be replacement, David, the Anointed One. See you next time for that.